Egypt Games, Chapter 16. The Oracle of Thoth. Strange as it may seem, Mrs. Granger, the sixth-grade teacher at Wilson, was responsible for the next phase of the Egypt game. It all grew out of the fact that an assignment the class was reading just barely mentioned something called an oracle. Toby had a pretty good idea of what an oracle was, but he decided to ask Miss Granger about it, in the hopes of getting her started on one of the long-winded explanations. A test was scheduled for the end of the period, and Mrs. Granger had been known to forget about such things, if you handled it just right. So Toby asked a question about oracles. Sure enough, it worked. He picked on a subject that Miss Granger could really get her teeth into. She'd got that gleam in her eye and started out full blast, and Toby settled back, feeling sure she was good for the rest of the time until recess. But the way it turned out, the whole thing sort of backfired, because by the end of the period, the whole class, Toby included, was as hung up on the whole oracle bit as Miss Granger was. As a matter of fact, it had completely slipped Toby's mind that he'd only asked about it to head off a test. Mrs. Granger could do that sort of thing to you if you weren't careful. During library period, which came next, a lot of people got stuff to read about oracles, and that afternoon there was another discussion in class. Everyone had come up with a lot of info about the different kinds of oracles and how they predicted the future in different ways, through the actions of sacred snakes or birds or fish, or even through the way that the inside of a dead animal were arranged when a priest cut it open. There was even one very famous one that was run by a priestess who went into a kind of trance or fit, and while she was clear off in this trance, she spouted out a lot of messages and stuff that were supposed to come right straight from the mouths of the gods. The oracles all had special sacred places, caves or grottos or special built temples, and they were all sort of far out things connected with them, like sacred fires or mystic vapors and magical statues. Among the stuff reported to the class was a list of countries that had depended on oracles to help the rulers decide how to run things, and one of those countries was Egypt. As soon as he heard it, Toby remembered reading something about Egyptian priests making predictions, but he just hadn't been thinking about the oracles in connection with the Egypt game until that moment. He snuck a glance in the direction of Ross in February to see if they had the same idea, and sure enough, they had. It was easy to tell. They were staring at each other in that way they had. If they were where they could talk, Toby thought to himself, one of them would be starting a sentence and the other finishing it, as if they had Siamese brains or something. Just at that moment, the girls stopped staring at each other and turned to stare at Toby. They were giving him that same bit with the eyes that they'd used on each other, and if he wanted to, Toby could have given it right back. He knew what they were saying all right. Instead, he slowly and deliberately made his eyes go all crossed and let his mouth fall open in a stupid idiot face. The reaction was just what he expected. The girls looked shocked, then angry. Then they turned their backs and worked hard to ignore him for the rest of the period. Toby let his mind go back to his plans for the afternoon with a feeling of satisfaction. They would have forgotten about being mad by the time school was out, and besides, they'd really asked for it. He told those girls before, Egypt was Egypt, but at school, you had to play it cool. The afternoon's 2 hours in Egypt turned out to be mostly a long discussion of the what and how of the Egyptian oracle. April had her mind set on the kind of oracle that got its messages from the gods through the high priestesses with fits, and naturally she was all set to be the high priestess. She would sit on a throne before the sacred fire, surrounded by swirling mystic vapors, and people who wanted predictions would write their questions on a slip of paper and drop it in the fire. She would then go into a trance, and then she would suddenly speak with the voices of the gods. That was just great as far as the trance was concerned, Toby thought. If anybody could throw a far-out fit, April could. And if he hadn't cooked up such a great idea himself, he'd have been tempted to go along with April's version just to see how she'd do it. But the fact of the matter was, he had a scheme that was going to make the oracle bit just about the greatest thing that had ever hit the land of Egypt. So much as he hated to do it, he set about spoiling April's plan. So, when they dropped their questions in the fire, he asked, how are you going to know what to answer, particularly if you haven't even seen the question? You must not have been listening in class today, April said. I don't have to know. The gods speak through the mouth of the priestess. Sometimes it was hard to tell whether April was kidding or whether she really believed stuff like that. Ken was looking at April in consideration. You really think the gods are... His voice faded. For a minute, he stared at April. Sheesh, he said at last. You really are cracking up this time. But Toby only raised an eyebrow and gave April his cool, amused look. Sure, he said. But don't you think we ought to have something else planned, just in case the gods don't get the message? Then, while April glared at him, Toby told everybody his idea, and naturally, everybody thought it was the greatest. Even April, after she had a chance to cool off. The way Toby saw it, somebody would think of a question that they had wanted answered about the future. Then they would write it on a piece of paper and bring the paper to the temple of the oracle. At the temple, the priest, or priestess, he added graciously, would pass the paper over to the sacred fire and do whatever the other stuff he could think of. Then, and this was the good part, he would take it to the special altar they would build for Thoth and put the question on his beak and leave it there overnight. Toby jumped up and grabbed Thoth down from the shelf and dusted him off. After all, Toby said, Thoth was an Egyptian god of wisdom, and this crazy priestess bit was something the Greeks thought up. That was a good point, and after that there wasn't much more argument, except that April did say that if they were going to be so particular, how about the fact that actually Thoth was supposed to be an ibis and not an old chewed-up owl? But nobody paid too much attention to her. They were all too busy starting in on Thoth's altar and planning the ceremony for consulting the oracle. It was decided that they would draw straws and the winner would get to be the first one to ask the oracle a question. They gave the straw to Marshall to hold and everybody drew. And just as you'd think, the winner was Ken, the one guy who really didn't want to win. Sheesh, said Ken. I don't know anything to ask. Anything I can't find out for myself. I don't even want to know. Now look, Toby said. You won and you can't cop out on it. That's poor sportsmanship. Anybody can think of a little old question about the future. I bet even Marshall could think up of a lot of questions. And he's only 4 years old. I can think up 3 bags full, Marshall said. Nobody ever got away with calling Ken poor sportsman. His chin got the hard look it got just before he slammed a home run. And after a minute you could tell he thought of something because his ears got red. Okay, he said. I got a question. Give me the paper. At that point, Melanie suggested that perhaps the question to the oracle ought to be written in hieroglyphics. But for some reason, Toby was against it. As soon as Ken had written his question, Toby grabbed the folded paper and, stepping up to the new altar, he started right in, being the priest of the oracle. By the time the certain party realized what had happened, she was too interested in what was going on to argue. Toby pressed the slip of paper to his forehead and walked 3 times around the temple. Then he made Ken kneel before the altar of Thoth and pressed the paper to Thoth's forehead, while Toby sprinkled them both with holy water from the tuna can. Next, he hung the paper on one of Thoth's long, sharp toenails and sprinkled it with more holy water. Finally, he waved it back and forth in the smoke of the incense burning, chanting, Hear us, O Thoth, ancient and wise, hear us and answer. There was no doubt about it. Toby made a great high priest. The other Egyptians were so caught up in his smooth solemnity and exalted priestly expression that they found themselves almost believing, well, half believing, that Toby was actually talking to an ancient and powerful being, and that something strange and supernatural was about to happen. So when Toby turned to them a moment later and thundered, Kneel and bow low, O ancient Egyptians, before the miracle of the oracle, they hurried to obey. A moment later, when they lifted their foreheads from the temple floor, the scrap of paper was hanging in Thoth's curved beak, and Toby was backing away from the altar, bowing at every step. When Toby had backed to where the others were kneeling, he got them up and hustled them out of the temple. Out in the middle of the storage yard, he dropped his high priestess expression. In his normal voice, he said, Well, I guess we might as well cut off. If we hang around, somebody's going to read what's on Ken's question before tomorrow, and that would ruin everything. April's eyes flattened. Like what, for instance? She asked. Just what do you have in mind that you might get ruined, Mr. Oracle? Have in mind, Toby said, giving her the wide-eyed, innocent treatment. I don't have anything in mind. It's just that I don't want anybody else to either. At least, not until we find out what the Oracle can do by itself. Wait a minute, Toby, Ken said, looking worried again. You don't mean to think that there's a chance it might. How? About what you said before. About the gods not getting the message and all that. Sheesh, sometimes I think the whole bunch of you guys are going off your rockers. Toby gave Ken a reassuring grin. Cool it, he said. I don't think anything. At least, not anything for sure. I just think we ought to give it a chance. Then if nothing happens, we can take turns being the one who makes up the answers. But what I do think is that you can never tell about a thing like this. He lowered his voice mysteriously. After all, it used to work, didn't it? I mean, all those other oracles weren't just kid stuff. Even kings and generals and all sorts of other adults used to go for this oracle stuff, didn't they? Well, as one person of the 6 Egyptians turned and looked back into the temple shed, the sun was very low, and the shade was deep in the back of the temple, where the new altar to Thoth had been built. The huge tattered owl seemed to be leaning forward, staring into the incense burner, and as they watched, a final twist of fragrant smoke curled upward like a dancing snake, and seemed to wind itself around the head of Thoth. Someone moved toward the opening in the fence, and the other 5 followed quickly, but it was almost as if nobody much wanted to be the last one out into the alley.